Hi there, everyone. Welcome back to another week of critical thinking. I think we are at a really fun time in the course. We have spent so much time thinking about what arguments are, what premises are, doing a lot of the sort of complicated work of identifying those, thinking about all the different niche ways we might categorize those types of reasoning. And last week, you had an opportunity to start forming your arguments, and I challenged you to do something which I think is really important in philosophy, which was to think about your language and to be very specific, very precise with the way you use language to convey your ideas. I think that's exceedingly important. And that continues, right? And so I hope that you're thinking about what it is you believe, why it is you believe those things. You're starting to look at the world around you, you're looking at music, you're looking at social media, and you're identifying the way people around you are making these arguments or trying to convince you of things so that you might believe with them or concur with them on certain issues. And you've had the opportunity now to create your own arguments, define the way you're using words in those arguments, and now you're all working with each other, you're challenging each other on these ideas, and it's just a good time to start thinking about as this course, as we have this week, and then we have 2 more weeks after this, and then that final week where we really wrap things together. I just think it's a really fun time. I also just think that the sources for learning this week are super fun. So you had those videos, which are coming from The Simpsons, and there are a bunch of examples of logical fallacies being used in that cartoon TV show. I also gave you guys this poster. I have my copy here. You can see it's like crinkled and dingled up, but I actually found this poster when I was an undergraduate philosophy student taking a logic class of my own. I wanted to have a copy of fallacies, a copy of ways that I can make poor arguments and not realize I was making poor arguments on hand. This was a resource I found. This is actually just a project based on philosophy education and also thinking about argumentation generally. So I was comfortable giving it to you all. Those three people in the middle there are supposed to represent Socrates, Aristotle, and Plato. If you don't know, are like the founding fathers of ancient Greek philosophy, but further, like really the discipline of reasoning, critical thought, and philosophy more generally. And I carried like this poster with me throughout undergraduate, throughout graduate school, and I just think it's a really fun, easy tool that is super helpful. And I also just think it's visually appealing and it's sort of interesting and it's an easy thing for you to just have on hand if you ever move on to write papers in classes to see if you're creating or if you're using logical fallacies in your arguments, or if you are ever thinking about debating ideas, you go into the public arena of debate or rhetoric around these types of things. If you ever take another philosophy class, it was a really helpful resource for me. I hope it's a helpful resource for you. And I also hope that those Simpson videos were a fun, lighthearted way to start thinking about logical fallacies. I don't suppose that this lecture is going to be super long. I just do sort of want to place what it is that logical fallacies are doing, tell you a bit of information about them that is not present, for example, in our textbook that I think is super important, um, and then just give you those resources as you engage with these tools. We throw around logical fallacies all the time, I think, in conversation. Um, to have a argument be fallacious is not necessarily that your argument is not valid or not sound, um, but it means something a little bit more than that. This fun little graphic I gave you, called them illusions of thought. It also characterized these fallacies as sneaky. Part of why this language illusion of thought is being used or sneaky is being used here is because fallacious arguments, that is, arguments that use logical fallacies, um, they present, or fallacies present themselves to be actual arguments with merit, but it's if you think about whether or not the reasons someone believes something actually do mean the conclusion they're asserting, a lot of the times you find out that logically it doesn't follow that that is enough reason to believe the conclusion. Remember I made that comparison to philosophical arguments almost being like math equations and you're solving for x in some of these arguments. You'd have to precisely reach some level of argumentation in order to successfully prove your arguments in the case of deductive reasoning. And in the case of inductive reasoning, you have to prove that it's strong. That is, it is believed for a good reason. And a lot of the times, even when you're using inductive reasoning, people who use these fallacies are very taboo in the academy, especially in the humanities. Um, but really, just generally, if you're ever doing any sort of academic project, it is best to avoid these. That being said, some of these, if you're looking at this poster, a lot of you might have read some of these fallacies, you might have been doing this reading and been thinking, I actually suppose that sometimes I do have that reasoning structure. That is the reason I believe something, but I actually think it is a strong argument, and that's fine. We'll discuss this here in a second. What makes a logical fallacy a fallacy is a flaw in reasoning, right? That's just going to be the working definition of what a fallacy is. There are a few of these fallacies that are going to always be pretty much by anyone you ask who's thought seriously about the ramifications of these fallacies. People are always going to say some of these fallacies are always fallacies. So like if we're making a spectrum here, super fallacious types of arguments include like ad hominems, strawman. Remember, ad hominem is a Latin phrase. It refers to a type of argument where you attack the person making the argument instead of actually attacking the ideas behind the argument. If you are ever attacking a person, you're saying like, well, you're dumb, so I don't believe your argument, and not dealing with the argument they presented to you. Generally, most people believe that's always fallacious. That is always committing a logical fallacy. Same here with strawman arguments. A strawman is, you should remember, when you re-describe someone's argument in a way that's easier to attack. So it is a good idea, actually. I do this myself. If I'm first ever encountering an argument, I repeat the argument back to them to make sure I understand. Or if I'm seeking clarification, I might say, are you saying this, right? But if I include those, for example, argumentative definitions in my retelling of the argument back to them, so remember from last week, those are definitions of words that have loaded into them the argument itself. If I do that, for example, I am making it impossible for my opponent to actually explain to me what it is they believe or they're thinking. We can't actually have a discussion anymore because I am sort of pushing my argument into the terms of the discussion before it ever gets off the ground. But strawmen are pretty much always thought of as always logical fallacies because the real thing here and what makes these always fallacious is you're not actually addressing the argument whatsoever. You aren't saying anything about the argument. For ad hominem, you're always saying something about the person making the argument, that is the arguer, or the person supposing the argument. In strawman, you're actually not debating the argument in front of you, you're debating what you wish they had said. And so we have some fallacies like these. And then you have more, I would say, controversial fallacies. So the two I just chose off the top of my head are the anecdotal fallacy and the slippery slope fallacy. Here's what I'm going to say about these. If you read our textbook for the logical fallacy chapter, authors, sort of to be easier with you, pretends that we're all perfect robots, we never commit fallacies, and that we're never doing any of these things, and that fallacies are never committed, they're always wrong, and we never build our beliefs in the academy, or like that is at school, using fallacies or personally. That really just isn't the case, right? And it is also the case that there are conversations happening in especially the humanities, that some of these things that we call fallacies might still have value that is not logical per se. That is, they might not be logically perfect, but there still might be a reason we use them in arguments. A good example here is the anecdotal example. What was the anecdotal fallacy? If you'll remember, it's using an anecdote or a personal experience from your life and using that to make some generalization about all cases, right? So if I had a bad experience with a student from Indiana University, and I use that to make some generalization about all students from Indiana University. One student I was interacting with was rude, and then I say, well, I imagine all students from Indiana University are rude. That would be fallacious, right? It was kind of like that example I gave you back when we were learning about types of arguments. And I said, you knew two philosophy majors who had cats, and you just assumed all philosophy majors have cats. You're building some generalization based off of anecdotes in your own experience, and that is logically imperfect. However, it is the case that a lot of the times most of us believe things on the basis of our experience. Um, in the philosophy of religion, for example, there are philosophers who say that people have experiences that make them religious, and to say that using those experiences as reasons or as testimony for held beliefs, say that that is fallacious or not a good argument style, kind of undermines something that's critically important, right? Similarly, there's a lot of people who are there are a lot of people in different types of studies that also would say this is unhelpful. So, in like disability studies, for example, disabled people write about experiences of being disabled, and then from these experiences, try to think about what that might mean more generally for what it means to be disabled in the world, right? That is a way some people make sense of the world using personal anecdote. And to say it is never valuable or never helpful is not always, I think, a great idea. So part of what I'm doing in our lecture today is I'm trying to work out here like, no, you really never should be calling your opponent names. It's never helpful. But if your opponent is telling you something that they experienced and why that has shaped how they move through the world, um, I personally think, to put my cards on the table, there are times where that might have value, and we need to start taking seriously what it means for someone to share their anecdotes with us, to share their experience with us. It doesn't change, for example, that logically that way of reasoning is imperfect. What does change is when you're doing your assignment this week, when you are going onto the board, you're making arguments. I don't want you to sort of necessarily disregard someone's experience and say, I don't care about how you've experienced the world because I know that that's a fallacy. Like, that's helpful for you as you form your own beliefs to know that just because one person had one experience doesn't mean you should generalize that for all people. But it isn't very helpful if you want to, for example, actually have a discussion with someone to sort of say, I don't care about who you are and how that's shaped you. This other one, I chose actually because I read a paper the beginning of this semester that was in defense of the slippery slope argument. Um, and I discussed with you earlier what the slippery slope argument was. So remember what a slope is? A slope is this angle here. Can't see that triangle. And this triangle here, this sort of diagonal line or this bevel is a slope, right? So if you ever calculated slope in math class, you were calculating the sort of slope of a shape. We imagined our person was up here, and this slope was slippery. So after they took one step, they slipped all the way down, right? And so slippery slope fallacies, you'll remember, are sort of saying like, just because it is true in this example doesn't mean it would be true in all further examples. However, the reality is most of us think that we should be cautious about the ramifications of our actions moving forward and what they might mean and what the greater consequences of our actions might be, and that that's actually something worth considering when we do actually evaluate the ethicality or permissibility or justification of certain actions, right? An example might be when we're talking about the legalization of marijuana or of like tobacco or alcohol. Um, some people say that if we legalize marijuana, then it's going to lead to the eventual legalization of other hard drugs. And a common response is that's a slippery slope argument. That's a slippery slope fallacy, so to say. And it is true, it is fallacious. Just because when we're talking about an argument, in this example with the legalization of marijuana, we aren't discussing the legalization of other hard drugs. So bringing those topics in is really not a good idea if you're writing a paper, for example, because it muddies the waters. It makes it difficult for us to actually sit here with the example at hand and seriously deal with whether or not this one action is permissible or justifiable or ethical. But a lot of people make the point that we don't live in a world of perfect arguments. Choices we make have ramifications, right? So we do have to think about what are the consequences of our decisions. And while that might be logically unhelpful, the reality is we sort of have to deal with the social and cultural ramifications of our decisions before they ever get to become conversations. So there are philosophers who disagree about these fallacies. Some of them say the line of where fallacy is up here. They think it might be down here. And there is sort of a spectrum that as you all grow and write more papers and do higher level classes, you'll learn what is more acceptable, what's not more acceptable. But I do want you to sort of know um, fallacies are flaws in reasoning, right? If you think of arguments like math equations, if I plug in a slippery slope argument for x in my math equation, the fact is going to be that I have made a flaw in my reason. Does that mean we can never think about the ramifications or eventual consequences of single decisions? No. It might actually still be helpful. You do have to say, in this instance, I'm thinking about the ramifications of this action. Therefore, I'm going to say XYZ. You do have to really tell your audience what you're doing and why it's valuable, because we assume it's a fallacy and it's not helpful here. Same for anecdotal experience. If I was doing disability studies, I might say, I'm going to discuss this experience I had because I think it is a great way of presenting this argument that I am giving you here. I recognize it can't obviously speak for all disabled people, however, blah, 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 blah. A lot of people think that there's some value in experience. So, like, disabled people know something about disability that we cannot ever know as able bodied individuals. Um, that is fallacious, right? To say that an experience gives you a knowledge that other people don't have, you have to explain why you believe that. So, there is disagreement here. But at that same time, truly, there's never going to be an example where it's appropriate to call your opponent names or to lie and change their argument because you can think of an easier argument to respond to. You know, the poster says media sources and politicians might do this all the time. You might have heard politicians respond to the questions they wish you asked and not the questions you did ask, for example. Those things are really taboo and not helpful in critical thinking. These things are probably things you should avoid, but understand there's a conversation actively happening. And if you think for some reason you should do something that this poster or the textbook or those videos I assigned you would identify as fallacious, you do have to tell me why you think it's relevant that you continue to make the argument you're making. That being said, once you have identified, you know that you're doing something that's sort of interesting or different, and that you aren't ignorant to the fact you're doing something atypical, then I actually think you've entered a really fascinating conversation in the discourse around critical thinking, around arguments. And I don't want you to feel like you were locked or prevented by some of these things. These are really ways that can help you identify what your opponent might be doing in a debate, for example, or what you might be doing yourself, and really questioning whether or not that is a defensible way of thinking.